All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Ken Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Dwane. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks for doing this. It's only recently I stopped putting a Y in your name. I was searching for podcasts that you've done before, and I was like, she's never done a podcast. And I realized I've been spelling your name wrong for a long time. So I apologize.
My only question is why?
Oh, my God. This is going to be good. So Anne has an amazing background. Went to Harvard Business School, which is normally not that interesting, but in this case is interesting. Co-founded military.com and Affinity Engines, both of which got sold to Monster. You worked at Monster. Went to another company called Zinch and were CEO. Sold that to Chegg, which is also a public company. Now are founder and partner of Village Global, which is backed by people like Reid Hoffman, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Diane Green. What an amazing path.
Well, lucky. And I didn't co-found Affinity Labs with Chris. I stayed at Monster. And that's actually a really funny story because Monster acquired military.com.
Right.
And really what they liked about that community that was, serving military personnel and veterans and their families and helping them get their benefits and getting jobs after the service or using their education benefits was that we had established relationships with people that would last through life transitions. And Monster's problem as a job board was they would acquire a bunch of people, help them match to a job, and then they'd be gone.
Like the dating site problem.
Yes, exactly. So we became part of Monster, and Chris, rubbed his hands together. He says, okay, well, let's get to the next verticals. And it took months and months and months to figure out which vertical they would approve. And he's finally like, look, I'm leaving to start a company that creates vertical communities. And about 13 months later, Monster bought that company.
That's funny. That's probably the smartest way to have done that.
Yeah. So innovation sometimes happens outside.
What an amazing story. So I talked to Chris. So in podcast time, Chris Michel has just been on the podcast and shared his his amazing life story and his story about how to live a life. And I said, well, what should I ask Anne? I mean, obviously she's so professional. Everything's fantastic. He's like, well, she was an entrepreneur very early, like before college. Like he teased it, but he didn't tell me the answer. So what's he talking about?
Well, I don't think I built anything of value early, but I love the idea of entrepreneurship. So I love this alchemy of making 1 and 1 equal 11. Yeah. In the first definition of entrepreneurship that I learned was creating value beyond resources controlled or currently controlled. Yeah. So that's magic. And as a young girl, I read a book about Mary Kay Cosmetics. Yeah. And I'm embarrassed to say, I just couldn't believe it. I didn't know any women who had started businesses. And it was a business that created a lot of joy for the people who worked in it and for the people that use the products and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, boy, this is great. And so, as a little kid, I wanted to go to business school.
That's funny. As I think back, I read business books when I was a little kid. And I always had books about women, but I guess they were scientists. Like it was Madame Curie and things like that. I guess they weren't entrepreneurs.
Right. And it was funny because I used to think, well, necessity is the mother of invention. And I was like, okay, there's one woman in technology.
Right. What did Mary Kay, why did she start that company? Was it
I don't know. I think it might have been, I wish I could recall the book, but I think it might have been out of necessity.
Yeah, I'm guessing it was not a Mark Zuckerberg story.
Yeah, and it wasn't I think a lot of people do entrepreneurship when they can't find anybody who will hire them or it's the tough times or whatever, and they just make it up.
Yeah. I just listened to an interview with the woman who founded, I guess it was a Tim Ferriss interview, who founded SoulCycle.
Oh, yeah.
And I was always made fun of SoulCycle. No, not anymore. It was such an amazing story. She was really raising a kid and had no money and was in New York and just really, I love those the Silicon Valley entrepreneurial stories are great. But those are the ones that I love, McDonald's guy and all that, fantastic.
Or even creatives like J.K. Rowling says the rock bottom was the solid foundation upon which I built my life.
And then she did it.
Yeah.
So you started your career, and I'll jump around some chapters because I just find this interesting. You started in corporate America, right? You worked for
Nabisco. Yeah.
I went to Kellogg, and I didn't do it, but that was the thing that many people, they'd go to Procter & Gamble, and I was like, ugh, boring. But it probably wasn't. It was probably fascinating, wasn't it?
Well, I came out of college, and I took the one job that I got. And it was with a market research firm. And I will tell you, not to date myself too much, but I shared a computer. That's
wow.
how long it was
Yeah.
ago. But what was so interesting back then is if you had the data, you actually were quite valuable. And so we got to put together research and present it even to senior executives. And there was a very junior person not really knowing anything, but it had the truth of the data. And then that market research firm offered me to come in and do brand management at Nabisco. And when I went to Nabisco, it was so funny because I got a really great opportunity to help launch a product. And this is after a big leverage buyout. So most of the layers of management at Nabisco had been cut. So there was me, who knew very little, and then some very senior person who said, just figure this out. And it was amazing because we just got a lot of experience working with real stuff, real manufacturing, like, atoms, not bits. And I brought the world something called Planters Reduced Fat Peanuts.
Wow, yeah.
This was such a funny story because at the time, there was something called Snackwells, which had no fat.
Right.
And it was really going crazy for Nabisco, and they challenged every division, like the Planters and the Lifesavers divisions, to come up with a low-fat product. And we literally found a patent for a process that would take a container load of peanuts, crush them with a plunger, and have the peanut oil squirting out the side of this giant vat, and then release the plunger, create a vacuum, and inject honey roast syrup. So the funny part of this is the concept appeal of this product was amazing, but the product appeal was really low. So people bought this product exactly once.
Yeah.
So very good lesson.
Like Crystal Pepsi. You're like Zell. You were around for the acquisition, that was Barbarians at the Gate.
Yes.
Like that was one of the most famous acquisitions that you were in the aftermath of.
Yes. Well, and I have an even funnier story on that because in 1996, so back in the 1900s, we had these modems and we had this new thing called the internet. And some friends and I said, hey, let's create a website for Nabisco and we'll do things like, I don't know, sell Oreo cookie jars or have the Milk-Bone dog biscuit licenses we could order online. And it was just more of an experiment. So we got the chance to go and pitch the CEO, John Grennis, who John Grennis is in the book and the movie.
Yeah,
He's
right.
And so the CEO of RJ Nabisco is sitting in his office and there's he's smoking a cigar. This is RJ Nabisco, right? It's thick with smoke. And we pitched this idea for Nabisco Direct. And he says to me, "There a website?" He's like, I'm never going to be driving around Manhattan and see cars, taxi cabs with a ad for Nabisco.com. And now I'm thinking to myself, boy, he would see Firefly and Scopus and other like these billboards with Nabisco.com and everything else. So we went away with our tail between our legs. And on Monday, we get a call back. And they said, would you come back and talk to Mr. Grennis? And I asked his people, what happened? And they said, well, Mr. Grennis was at a cocktail party and someone asked, what's Nabisco doing on the internet? And he said, we're starting a whole division to focus on it. So that was a lucky break.
That's fantastic. And then Snackwells was a famous story too, because Snackwells was the thing that made everybody fat, right? Wasn't that the thing that sort of famously we got wrong about sugar versus fat? Like that was the thing.
Yes. So these unintended consequences, which is something we talk a lot about in Silicon Valley, are real. And what's so interesting, and this applies to artificial intelligence, but also to products, is humans are actually pretty easy to hack, meaning fat and sugar and salt and fear and outrage, we can be played in these ways. So.
What an interesting line to draw, too. So you end up at Harvard Business School, which everyone I interview either went to Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School, or Princeton. So, but in your case, you meet Chris Michel at Harvard Business School. Like, how did that connection happen?
I met him before. So this is a funny story. So my uncle was in the Navy. I came from a big military family. I didn't serve myself, but lots of people in my family did. And my uncle was doing this event, and he meets this young lieutenant, and he says, what's your next job in the Navy? And he says, well, I'm actually leaving the Navy to go to business school. And he says, oh, you should meet my niece. So we talked by phone, and this is funny because I looked Chris up in what was the Facebook, because it was the actual book.
Yeah, colleges used to have a book where everybody had a grainy black and white picture and like their hometown. That was it.
Yeah, and so we kind of talked, and we didn't really hit it off. You know, I'm a very like private person. I was like, who is this person?
Yeah.
And but then when I was moving in, Chris was like literally the first person I met at school, and we decided to be in a study group together with some other really fun people. And you know, when you meet with somebody every day and try to figure out these cases and crack the cases, you get to know them really well. And so it was funny because when we started the company, it just felt like one giant study group.
That is so funny. What a great story. So Chris, it's military.com is the company that he starts.
Yep.
And this is when things are exciting in Silicon Valley or not exciting in Silicon Valley? Like which phase of Silicon Valley are we in?
This was the heady days. So this was 1999 and 1998, 99, and Chris had this epiphany when he was on a Naval Reserve weekend, and there was this thing called women.com, and he's like, okay, women.com is, you know, growing and but most importantly, it was raising a lot of money, and military folks have a real reason to want to connect, right? And our fundamental premise was you can't change behavior, but you can try to make behavior that people are already doing easier, faster, cheaper, right? So help each other get jobs. Where do you live when you move to a new community? What do you do when a spouse or parent or whatever gets deployed? And so we started that community. The word social network or professional network did not exist. Right. It was like it was a vertical portal or like I don't know, really interesting time. It was Friendster times.
It was before that. And it's so hard to think back and overlay. You're like, well, obviously it was a social network for the military, but at the time everything was a little. Right, you'd call it a vertical. There was a vertical for chemical companies called like Chemdex, and that was going to be the thing. And so now you look back and you go, well, yeah, of course people would come online, but when we started Friendster, people were like, no one's ever going to put a photo online. Like that's ridiculous. Like sober up. Like photo online, it's not safe.
Well, yeah, and there was a company called Planet All, which I think was acquired by Amazon and kind of shuttered, which we had seen before, and it would let you know a second degree connection, which was so important, right, in this whole evolution of the internet into moving networks online. And then the military community has this amazing aspect, which is you will always take the call or try to be helpful to someone else who served, and especially if you served, you know, let alone in combat or in these extreme situations, but you come of age with this unbelievable experience and sacrifice. So it was really just a pleasure to serve that community, and I'd like to say it was all easy, but 2001 hit, and I remember sitting in the boardroom, and David Liddell, one of our board members, who had run Xerox PARC, which invented the Ethernet and the GUI and all this amazing stuff, he said, you know, entrepreneurship is a lot less like launching an aircraft off the aircraft carrier and a lot more like a lonely Humvee in the desert, and get ready. Yep. And we had to, you know, do some really tough stuff of reducing the workforce from like 80 people to like 14, I don't know. And it was so painful. And the good news is we're having our 20-year reunion for military.com next year.
So
we're
what
planning.
Was that? So Chris Michel tells two stories about that, which are I really resonate. One is there was a phase where they bring in another CEO, which you know that often sometimes it ends well, a lot of times it doesn't. And he tells the moment when he came in and the guy was like sitting in his chair and he was talking to the guy, being a moment of just like, you know, humiliation or whatever it is. And then he says he kind of went into I don't know if it's a depression, but would just swim laps for like days and days and days until he figures out what he thinks he's learned. What were those times like for you? Like the turnaround part's great, but you didn't know that at the time.
Oh yeah, no, we didn't know. I mean, that is though the one time you kind of look into the abyss and you say, okay, the worst thing that happens is this thing just goes under, and we take care of people and we put the plan in the drawer. Yeah. We had an orderly shutdown plan in the drawer.
Yeah.
And this was actually, I really credit some of the folks in the military that were working at military.com, because they said, well, the consequences of this are no one dies, right? So that kind of put it in perspective. But then we made the plan for the orderly shutdown. We put it in the drawer, and then we got back to work.
Yeah.
And the funny part is, I remember doing sales calls, and I'd fly to Red Eye to New York or wherever the customer was. And we had customers not paying us because they're like, oh, you're .com, you're going to go out of business, all this stuff. And fly the red eye because we wouldn't want to pay for the hotel, do the sales pitch knowing that if we didn't close that deal, we could not make payroll.
Yeah.
And so at first you're like, oh my God, this is so much pressure. But then you're like, okay, just do it. Just do it. And so you kind of get desensitized to that kind of extreme.
And is there a point when you think about it where you just go back to consulting? Like, do you think that way or?
Well, yes. There's that parallel universe. And in fact, when I came out here after business school, I drove cross country and I showed up at this little startup, and this, maybe 15 people, and the CEO greets me at the door and says, hey, come on into my office. And I'm like, this is going to be great. I'm going to work with the CEO of this startup. And he says, I sold the company yesterday. You don't have a job.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, okay, there is a parallel universe right now where I went back to consulting, right?
Yeah.
And that I'm now in something, but totally different. But it's back to kind of resilience. Like, I used to think some people are just successful and more, luckier or whatever. And now I'm just like, no, they're just more resilient, and they don't let it end at those places.
Yeah. As we, my partner and I invest in people, and we've just figured out who those people are, and they didn't necessarily go to Stanford. Like, we meet some people, nothing wrong with people who went to Stanford, but you meet some people and you're like, that guy is so impressive. And the second things get tough, that guy is so out of there. Like, there is no way he has any idea about the concept of missing a payroll.
Yeah.
You can just sense it. And some people you're like, oh, she's going to power through. Up to a reasonable point.
Well, no, that's so true. And, I'm fascinated by this concept of potential.
Yeah.
And, I did a lot of stuff in the college admissions space, not the side door, the regular front doors.
Right.
And they, this concept of potential, you shouldn't judge potential based on context. Really good admissions people think about potential in the way to change over time, and how resourceful are you? Like, what do you do with the stuff you got? Yeah. And those are actually things that I think are very apt for assessing entrepreneurs. Yeah,
I've talked to, try to have a lot of women, people of color on this podcast, and understanding those are all different issues. But one of the things that has come up is especially people of color, is the sort of safety net issue where they're like, look, Mark Zuckerberg, part of why he succeeded, not to take anything away from him, is that he had this, like, plan B was great, and plan C was great, and plan D was great. So what the hell? He could just take a risk. And they're like, I came from this family, and my parents saved every penny, and I kind of had to take the job at Goldman Sachs a little bit more. And they're like, well, it's not that I'm not entrepreneurial. It's that I'm a little more roughed up at that stage of my life.
Yeah, there is no buffer, right? It's like when people are living paycheck to paycheck and there's a disaster that happens, like a natural disaster, right? There is no buffer, right? Yeah. So, that's totally the case.
It's fascinating. So you end up, you've done it twice. Like, you've built it, I guess, Affinity Engines acquired, big success. You go back to it again, but this time supporting an entrepreneur at Zinch. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. And I credit a lot of things in my life to the people who have given me chances. And Mike Leventhal, who is a partner at Mayfield, had invested in military.com through the good and the bad.
Yeah.
And then he had found this young team in Utah, and it was a college dropout. His brother and his friend, always the recipe for success. He said, hey, can you come out, talk to this little team that's called Zinch. It's to make it a cinch to get in and pay for college for Generation Z. Yep. And I went out and met this team, and Mick Hagan's story was really compelling. He was, part of the first generation of his family go to college. He got his standardized test scores back, and they're right on the cusp of where he might get into a school of his dreams. He puts together a portfolio of his computer science and basketball and photography. And he sends that in with his application with the tagline, "I'm more than a test score." And he gets accepted to Princeton. I don't know if you were joking about that earlier, but he only stayed there a year because he said, there are lots of people just like me. And it happens whether you have, you don't test well or you test really well, but there's just more competition. We have more dimensions. And there's more to this than the standardization that's happened in our education system. So Zinch was supposed to help you showcase yourself as more than a test score, to be matched with the kind of colleges, scholarships, internships, whatever that might be a good fit. And it was a really good idea. The timing was impeccable around 2008. So we decided to raise money in yet another very difficult fundraising time. But it was such a bright team. And I remember leaving, and Sid and Mick and Brad, they kept calling me and like, hey, we talked about those key metrics and we've moved them again. And it was just so fun. So it was a real treat to go back and join them. Right. Small group, and kind of grow that. And that company was a lot about unleashing potential.
Yeah, that is such an interesting, like, I grew up in La Jolla, California, and like applied to like 4 colleges and got into Northwestern, and that was kind of a disappointment because you didn't get into Stanford. Like, in that world, there were like 5 colleges that people thought, there's like 1,500 colleges or something. I don't know what it is. And you kind of, the whole world was like, well, there's Harvard, Stanford, Santa Barbara. You said you had this tiny, tiny universe that you would even think about.
Yeah, well, and so it's a lot less important where you go and a lot more important what you make of yourself wherever you go.
Yeah.
And the other, I would say this demonstrates the power of the lists. So U.S. News and World Report has a ranking, which is probably right for some people on some dimensions or something, but because that is simplicity on the other side of a lot of complexity, people kind of glom onto it. It's like, okay, that's number one. No, and the reality is that like 1,000 flowers can bloom, and there are so many choices, and it's become this crazy rat race where parents sometimes seek validation for like where their kids got in. I mean, it's really twisted. So, I hope it's changing. But
yeah. What do you think? Just curious, what do you think about the physicality of like where you go to college? Like, there's great colleges. I have friends, they go to like Bowling Green or something. Mm-hmm. It's like, my mom went to Grinnell, which is a liberal arts school in Iowa. Does it matter that you, like if you go to San Jose State, for example, you're in Silicon Valley. If you go to UCLA, you're in Hollywood if you're doing film, as opposed to going to Cornell's a great school, but it's in the middle of nowhere. Upstate New York. Yeah.
Ithaca is gorgeous.
I hear it's beautiful.
It's, so it probably matters less now than ever before in human history where you are, because of the interweb.
Yeah, right.
I think that is a huge opportunity. And there's a great quote about learning, which is, no one can stop you from learning, right? That's a decision that you can make, right?
Right. What do you think you learned as you were at military.com? You weren't in the military, but your partner was. Is there anything that you learned about the military, about leadership from the military, like from the military people, from Chris? Yeah. That's a little, because I was telling Chris, like everybody I know who's in the military, and my friends were in the military, they were doctors and aviators, they weren't Vietnam draftees.
Yeah.
Had a great experience. Like nobody complains about it. It sounds miserable to me, but it's very important to them. They think it was very lovely. They think they learned a lot.
Yeah. I would say, again, I have such admiration for people who make this service and sacrifice. What I learned about military, and I think the big myth is that it's this giant hierarchy and people do what they're told. But the reality is they have many people today are trained to improvise, adapt, and overcome. And they have this concept in the Marine Corps, which was the strategic corporal, which is if the mission is to get across the river, the mission may be to build a bridge. Like you have to figure it out, but get across the bridge. And I think that the other thing, I get the opportunity to go out to an aircraft carrier. It's a 4,000 person operation with a nuclear reactor and a working airport and this crazy operational thing whose only mission is to project power over in remote locations. And every person we met could recite the mission of that craft carrier, and they felt part of something bigger than themselves.
Right.
And that's amazing. I mean, it's amazing.
It always does kind of blow me away and I see this all the time. You see entrepreneurship everywhere. You're like, the guy running a Walmart or running a division in the military is running a bigger business than almost any Stanford MBA in Silicon Valley. If you think, I have 20 people in my company, it's like that guy's got 200 and they have guns, and you think you got a job. Like,
and stress and, all that stuff. And I'll never forget somebody, one of our team members said, I didn't get to pick my team. My team was assigned to me.
That's right.
And guess what? We had a job to do.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of adversity,
Yeah.
and like the most extreme adversity. So I think that's great, and meaning I think that to appreciate that, and then obviously hiring veterans, there's lots of opportunities now to hire veterans. It's just an unbelievable talent pool.
And so how do you make your way? How do you think Silicon Valley changed over time? Like, as you've kind of been through those periods, has it gotten better? Has it gotten more cynical? Like, I mean, you guys are really at the beginning creating something that created value for the military. Like, kind of hard to argue you weren't doing some kind of good there.
Well, I don't know, but I think we were just trying to, again, do things better, faster, cheaper. Like, we were intrigued by this, and this awesome power of connecting people as had never really been done before, and at that speed, at least because of this technology. So I don't. I do think there is a little bit more commercialism today. Yeah. And then the pace of change just means that we have to be more careful about the unintended consequences of all this stuff.
Do you think the people coming to Silicon Valley, though, are animated by the things that animated you and Chris Michel when you guys came here? Or is it more like, I'm going to get a job at a thing and I'm going to make $10 million, and if I don't make $10 million, I'm moving to the next thing? Or am I being too cynical?
I think you're cynical. I mean, I live by being an optimist, like I am.
Yep.
But I think this, the world is driven by people who think there's a better way, and we can assemble that together. And so, well, I do think there are a lot of people who keep score with money and all that kind of stuff. I think that there are tons of people with the desire to make a change in the world and to create something bigger than themselves.
It is funny looking back. Like, you say military.com was a social network, and it was. It's just interesting to see how certain people, like, my partner Jonathan Abrams was one of them, where they kind of just see something in the world that you don't see. It's just such an odd thing. Like, I don't. Well, and now I see it. Now everyone's like, well, yeah, of course, social network. Like, if I wasn't busy, I would have invented, like. Well,
so this is, in one sense, the thing we talk a little bit about at Village, which is insight. So comedians don't see a different world than the rest of us. They see the humor in the world. And entrepreneurs don't see a different world. They see the opportunity in the world. And that it's a way of that perspective, right, which makes all the difference in the world.
That's such a good, it's such a good analogy too, because another thing that comedians do, as soon as they say it, you get it. Like, right. As soon as they point out, you laugh because you're like, yeah, that is ridiculous. But they also do go through a process of like, no, that didn't work. That didn't work. Boom, that's the one, which is such an entrepreneurial process. Or for some people, it's not. Some people are like, light bulb done. There it is.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, I just learned this the other day. There's a compound called WD-40 that you can use to do those things. And do you know why it's called WD-40? Because there were 39 previous tries that didn't work.
That's funny. Of course I know WD-40. Like, that's an essential part of any home. Like, do you have a squeaky home? You've got to get WD-40. I think it's pretty amazing that we've talked so much about your career. You worked for Paul Allen, too. At one point. Like, I just dropped that out, and you have a completely full career without that.
Well, so actually, after I showed up at my startup and was told that I no longer had a job, I was like vacillating, like, what am I doing? And I called a friend, and he said, I think you can work here at this thing called Interval Research. And Interval Research was a think tank founded by Paul. And Paul just was an amazing person because, as you probably know, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Like in 1980 or something. So he stayed on the board of Microsoft, but he really, put his affairs in order. And then he went into remission.
Yeah.
And so he created lots of stuff. And it was a really exciting time to be there in Silicon Valley on Page Mill Road, and talking to all these innovators.
Yeah. So you come at last to, after having operated thing after thing after thing, to being an investor, to working at Village Global, which is a venture capital firm. There's plenty of venture capital firms around, but this one is a little bit unique. Like, partially the backers are very famous people. I mentioned, is Diane Green a backer of it?
Yes, she is.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
I realized like 2 seconds before the podcast, I was listening to 3 dudes. And I was like, I'm sure there's more.
And Wojcicki. And,
right.
And Judy Estrin and Sara Blakely.
Great. And so, why? Like, why did you become an investor, and why on this, with this amazing group of people? Like, what's the...
Yeah. Well, I remember being at Chegg about a year after the IPO, and I was talking to Dan Rosenzweig, and he said, "Oh, you should think about VC." And I really hadn't thought about it. And, I credit him with causing me to think. And I love the idea of investing. Again, how do you get the power of compounding, or more than compounding, right? Yeah. Not just saving or something like that, but investing, and not trading, but investing, like building. And so in looking to the future and trying to, read the tea leaves, and then most importantly, back people who are out to do amazing things. And you kind of get the delight of having at least maybe a small part in helping them realize what they're out to achieve. And you're right, Village has a really interesting model, because we think of ourselves, venture, as a network, and it starts with the LPs who are named, and they are founders themselves with still love of the early stage game, and we ask them to invest time and money. And we don't want to oversell that, but practically that means an event or two per year, and many of our portfolio founders have had sit downs with Sara Blakely or Bill Gates or Bob Iger or whoever, and then the second aspect of the network is, instead of us at headquarters like picking the entrepreneurs, we actually curate a network of angel investors who help us discover and support founders. And we invest alongside them and try to bring this extended network that can have some advantage in terms of hires and experts and customers and investors. So it's kind of like a giant, in one sense, productized scout program, if you will.
And how has that felt for you? I mean, when you were running companies, you had a team you met with, you had, I don't know, any number of people reporting to you, say 100 people reporting to you, and now you probably don't. You're meeting with people all day long, and yes and no, probably no more than yes. How does that feel? Like, how does that transition sit with you?
Well, it's different, and you never can take the wheel because it's not your company, right? And I think, though, my perspective on advice has changed a lot, because I used to think, oh, well, if I'm asking for advice, tell me what to do. But now I feel like things are changing really fast. Context shifts. People are really smart. So advising is a lot about bringing the answers out and maybe sharing how we thought about it. Maybe there are some quick tips, like you should use this template for whatever. Yeah. But in general, it's helping people think through what they're out to do.
Right. And do you match them? Do you say, I've seen this, like, how do you do that? For example, do you say to somebody, I've seen people do this, and by this iteration, if it's not working, it's not working. Like, is it like that? Or is it really like the psychology of, well, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm qualified to ask like deep psychology questions, but no, I do think that it's not checkers, it's chess. Like, what's the next move, and where would that lead you, and how would that differentiate you, and is that sustainable, and what's driving that, and what should you not do, right? And what is the trade-off of that, and kind of thinking through. Because I think often even coaches aren't telling you what to do. Right. They're helping you just think through the process and then arrive at a conclusion.
Why do you think so many, I think a lot of VCs give kind of bad advice. And it takes this form. It's product advice, which they just like doing. So they give product advice. Like, I was talking to this guy, or I saw this, and so you got to do this. Or they went to a conference, and it's like all about whatever it is. And then they go into a mode of like, if you don't do what they said and things don't work out, they have an attitude of like, like, if you'd done my idea, which is, if you're an entrepreneur, you're like, that's a ridiculous idea. Like,
Yeah.
you're not in this. You're jetting around doing whatever. I mean, do you observe this or?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the interesting thing is, sometimes I think there's no bad ideas. It's just like this combination of idea, execution, timing, context, But my partner, Ben Kasnoga, actually has a little talk about how to take advice. And one thing that an entrepreneur should be constantly doing is being curious and asking for the feedback, getting the feedback. But then I guarantee on any given day, potentially even me and my other partner, Eric, or something could give even conflicting advice. Like we might have different opinions, but
Right.
maybe that's good for the CEO to hear or the founders to hear, and then they choose.
Yeah, we have, as we have our fund, people kind of ask us that, like, can you add a value to the entrepreneur? And it's interesting because we have this dual answer of like, yeah, we can. And first of all, a lot of the advice that VCs used to give, I think, has been taken over by YouTube, right?
Sure,
if someone's
yeah.
like, how do I do this? Literally, how do I fire somebody? Like literally, like, you need to have two people in the room,
Yeah.
however that works. You can kind of go look that up on YouTube. And so what we kind of say is like, well, we don't want entrepreneurs that need too much advice. Like, we want the entrepreneurs that tells us to like go stick it and they'll call us later. Like Mark Zuckerberg set up his board so that he didn't have to listen to anybody.
Yes,
And I'm
that's
sure
right.
he did listen to Mark Andreessen and so forth, but
Yeah, no, and so how do we just put a super booster or an extended network on somebody who's going out to go and conquer what they're excited about doing?
And in what you're doing, as I've talked to people on this podcast, in terms of including more people in venture capital, there aren't a ton of women in venture capital, although there's more.
Yeah.
In fact, I had Ellen Powell on recently, and I was like,
Yeah.
what the heck happened? Like Kleiner, like all these VCs we have today were at Kleiner. Like Mary Meeker was there, Aileen Lee was there,
Trey.
Trey Vassallo was. It's just kind of so there are a bunch, and then I've had Charles Hudson on recently talking about what it's like to be a black guy in venture capital. What do you make of the landscape of having a few more women now, not many people of color, being such a white male thing?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, and I think there's it's not just that we should be more diverse. It's actually a great business decision, and that's proven time over time. And and part of the village model is those angels, those we call them network leaders in our model. Some of them are very proven angels with a track record, and some are not. This is literally their first time angel investing, but we believe they have access to great founders and they have judgment about who can build a big game-changing venture scale business. And so we entrust first check capital to both of those kinds of people, to all kinds of people.
That's really, I've heard a new thing. LinkedIn, Jeff Weiner's the CEO,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I saw him interviewed recently on CBS, and it's really interesting because they talk about how powerful your network is and how important your network is, and LinkedIn's the tool for that. But then there's this little thing in their mind that they're kind of realizing, which is like, well, poor kid in the projects in Chicago doesn't have that.
Correct.
And so they've got, so yeah, sure, if you went to Stanford, you've got a great network, like good for you. And so they've got some new thing, I forget what, but they're addressing it somehow. They call it like network plus one. So they're like, have a network, but go find someone who's, this is just in the last few years I've heard this.
Yep.
Add somebody who's not
Right.
in your network.
Networks can be self-reinforcing. And so I think one way to think about it is there are closed networks and there are open networks. And if what we think about is what are the nodes in networks that aren't exposed? Because a network gets stronger as it gets not redundant. There's some redundancy in a network, which is good. But the other is a network gets more useful if it's extended.
Yeah.
Right. And so, we're thinking a lot about network vitality and then the outreach. And we invest around the world, which I like to say our last name is global because we are trying to find those.
Yeah. I talked to a guy who's a venture capitalist in Washington, D.C. And his thesis, he's a black guy, his thesis is there's all these minorities, underrepresented people, who I can just make more money investing in them because they're not really picked over. It's not going to be very expensive to get in. I don't have a lot of competition, is what he's saying. And as he goes out to raise capital, he gets people trying to give him money. like foundations, like we want to give you money. He's like, well, no, like I'm actually trying to frame this as it's a competitive advantage as a profit-making venture capitalist.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. But you genuinely think that it's a competitive advantage to be investing in women, people of color outside of Silicon Valley?
Yeah, underestimated. I mean, that's
right.
Yeah.
So what are you optimistic about the future? Like, what does Village Global look like for the next five years? Does it raise funds like a?
Yeah, we have a $100 million fund. I think there's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur, right? I mean, there's, and we invest in two ways. We have an accelerator, which is has one-to-one mentorship, and you can do it virtually, which is really exciting because I do think there's entrepreneurs everywhere, and it's hard to get to Silicon Valley. And then we believe in the strength of these edges of networks, and maybe the combination of some expertise and capital that's here with the expertise and knowledge and insight with someone in their local community is really powerful. And then just standard seed investing. So we're still learning and iterating.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more thing before we wrap up. The sort of Silicon Valley being the capital, James Currier says it's like the capital city. It's like being in Rome and, whatever.
He's great.
He went to Princeton. I went to Northwestern. But whatever century it was that you wanted to be when Rome was the capital city. If you're in the movies, you want to be in L.A., not in Ames, Iowa. Do you think, obviously there's entrepreneurs around the world. Do you think the great ones kind of come to, like as Mark Zuckerberg did, he wasn't in Silicon Valley, but he came here? Or do you think like, no, you can just be a great entrepreneur in Dublin and the whole thing goes up in Dublin and we'll invest and you'll never be in Silicon Valley? Like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I'm long Silicon Valley. I'm also long the rest of the world. And I don't actually know anyone in Silicon Valley who says, boy, I hope it stays here. I think everyone's like, hey, let's it's a
little crowded here.
And have more people participating in the economy and pursuing what they want to do. But it has never been more easy to have a distributed team than today. And that's super exciting to figure out. I think if people could live where they want to live and live how they want to live and contribute to whatever value they're trying to create, that unleashes a ton of productivity. So I think there'll be a lot of value created.
And I think the economics of just living here are kind of driving that a little bit, where
Correct.
you're like, look, we can have our BD guy here, we can have our CEO here, she can meet with the venture capitalist, but her engineering team is going to be back in, you name it, Turkey, Croatia, Mexico, whatever it is.
And we're really bullish on some folks who have worked here and go back to their home countries and start an amazing business. We backed a company called Adi in Bogota, Colombia, and it's point of sale financing for Latin Americans. And the CEO saw lots of experience here, but really wants to create something in his home, in the home region. So
what a great story. So how do people get in touch with you, but how do they follow you? How do they follow Village Global, become aware of Village Global, connect to what you guys are thinking? Yep.
So we have on our website, you can apply if you have a business idea and you want funding for, and we read every application and for the accelerator and seed. And then also, if you want to be an angel investor with us, a network leader, you can also, there's an application form on there, and you can follow us on Twitter. I'm not very vocal on Twitter, but maybe it's one of my new resolutions that I'll commit to verbally here.
You're the quietly powerful woman in Silicon Valley. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ken.
All right. And Dwane has been my guest. This is the Zoning Venture Podcast. Talk to you next time.